911. What are you reporting?
You guys still with me? Y'all okay after that trailer? Yeah, you should be thanking me that is all I showed. Because I'm just going to say it, guys. If you were one of the few that were amongst having this happen to them from Terrifier 2, this movie's not going to be for you. Hey, how's it going, everyone? Pragmatic Addict here. Thank you guys so much for checking out this video. So this is a movie that I have been keeping my eye on for quite a while now. But I've also been very cautious of this one because this has been compared to the film Skinamarink. Not in the sense of what it's about, but in the sense of experimental horror. Now, as far as experimental horror goes, I'm very cautious of it because when I think of experimental horror, I think of a mystery. I think of, tropes of horror that people are, experimenting with. Not necessarily the artsy kind of things. I consider those indie horrors. Experimental horror is if you're trying something, if you're attempting something, if you're testing something horror elemented out. And again, like I said, I've been keeping my eye on this one. Obviously, after the small clip that I just showed you guys at the beginning of this video, this was a trailer that was probably the most nerve-wracking I saw behind Skinamarink. Now, I know a lot of people thought that Skinamarink was very nerve-wracking. I was not a big fan of that film personally, which it was my most anticipated film of this year. But this one, I have a lot to say about this one. I have a lot to say about the Outwaters. Which I was actually, for the longest time, thinking that this was called the Outer Waters. Maybe it was because I was getting it mixed up with the Outer Limits. But this is called the Outwaters. And this has been a very vague promoted film. From everything from what the multiple plot synopsises state, to what the trailer states, to even what a lot of the movie, if not all of it, is kind of presenting to you. This is a very vague film. So the plot of this movie is that a group of friends who are also musicians, they're in a band together, they are traveling from Los Angeles to the Mojave Desert to shoot a music video, and when they arrive there, a bunch of unexplainable and horrifying stuff starts happening to them. When I say that I have a lot of thoughts on this film, I mean a lot. There is a variety in this film as a horror film, as an experimental film, as however you want to look at it and in whatever direction you want to look at it. There's just a lot to unpack here. Now, heads up, I'm going to be mentioning the Blair Witch Project a lot in this movie because this film, you can tell just by watching it that the director of this film is a huge fan of the Blair Witch Project, as am I. And some of the stuff that I liked about this movie, it does come off a little bit biased because it is very reminiscent to Blair Witch Project, which I would actually go as far as to say that I can count, with my fingers, how much stuff in this film was actually ripped out directly from the Blair Witch Project. Starting with the actual intro of the movie. So this film is set up like your classic people are about to go missing found footage horror film, and the stuff that you're about to see is evidence that has been found, like the Blair Witch Project. There is even missing posters as promotions for this film that I was just kind of is another thing where I was like, okay, yep, I've seen the Blair Witch. Another thing about this film is that I am very mixed on a lot of things about it. So for example, the first, I would say, half of this film, it is a lot of your typical found footage film where you're seeing just the characters just kind of being dumb. You're getting some backstory and some character development, but a lot of it is them just kind of partying. It's them just kind of, goofing around, fucking around, and filming random shit as they're traveling to the Mojave Desert. And one thing I will say that I kind of did respect in this degree is that this film is actually filmed and presented in the format that feels like it is from the perspective of a tourist. Someone that is actually traveling to somewhere that they're excited about, somewhere that, they are interested in, somewhere that they've never been to before and kind of want to document, their stay. But going back to the biased opinions, another thing that I really enjoyed, again, is biased, is that I live in Arizona. I was born and raised here. I am a desert local. And seeing that this is going to be centered around the desert, let me paint a picture for you. This is basically the Blair Witch Project, except in the woods. It's happening in the middle of nowhere in butt-fuck desert, where fucking Courage the Cowardly Dog's house is located. When I said there's a lot to unpack here, everything from the horror to the sound design to an experimental horror film, things that they try and test out, to even like filming techniques. Yes, all these people, this group of friends, they are obviously, you know, traveling from Los Angeles to this designation. They're also there to shoot a music video. And what I want to say is that this is presented. So in order to make this make sense, I have to kind of like display some of the stuff that is actually presented in the movie. So when I say that this is based off of like evidence that was found from people, it is actually based off of memory cards that were in the cameras. And there's multiple memory cards throughout the movie that all has different shit recorded on it from different points of view and everything. And one of the memory cards is basically from one of the filmers that was like directing the music video, stuff that, you know, he was seeing as a director. You get a lot of shots, a lot of very actually cool filming shots in this film that make you kind of, you know, tilt your head a little bit and you're like, oh, look at that. It also gets to play around with like a trippy kind of like psychedelic vibe a lot of times too, in that degree, because a lot of the times a lot of these people, while they're kind of, you know, traveling and shit, again, it is in that very classic, tedious found footage character format where a lot of people are just goofing off and doing drugs and getting drunk and shit on the way to the designation. Which is actually something I want to talk about, which was a big kind of like thing that upsetted me, is that not only does this go on for a long time, but that kind of format is, you know, that setup takes a long time to kind of not only like come to a close, but it's just very tedious because half of this movie, I shit you not, which, you know, in reassurance factors, this is like a 110-minute movie. So this is a long movie, but still a lot of that, maybe the first entire act or so, these people just interact with each other, and none of it is really engaging. Not a whole lot of it is really like impactful or important. You're just seeing who these characters kind of are, which are your basic found footage horror characters, before they, you know, get to this designation. Now, before I get into the goods, the stuff that people want to hear about, I will say this. This film had what it took to make an actually good fucking horror film off of this project, but a lot of that kind of prevented that is, again, just spending so much time on these characters, and so much of that time on these characters being about just throwaway shit. Now, getting to a lot of things, from a horror film to specifically an experimental horror film to a horror film that is very inspired by the Blair Witch Project, I will say this. Much like the Blair Witch Project, again, you're going to hear me say that a lot of times, but like that movie, this is a movie that, where the main threat is nature. A lot of the horror, at least from what it seems like in the first majority of this film or so, is sound design, and it is fucking good. Now, when I said that a lot of the stuff feels like just blatantly ripped out of Blair Witch Project, for example, there are times where you are following a streak of blood from one of the people, where a lot of the times you're intense, hearing very alarming, very disturbing shit that only your mind could play tricks on you or make you think, well, is the desert actually haunted? Is something out there? Like the Blair Witch Project, except, like I said, instead of being in the middle of the woods, you're stranded in the middle of nowhere. Now, I do have a lot of criticisms about this film. I am very mixed on it. Now, the reason why I liked Blair Witch Project, which I know a lot of people think, you know, is just a very boring film. It's a mess. It's just people getting paranoid, lost in the woods, with their minds playing tricks on them. Now, here's the thing, is that the reason why I understand that, but the reason why I actually like Blair Witch Project is because it had a genuine, creepy fucking lore to it. It sparked something of an era where the way that it was promoted and presented, it was so realistic, and people actually thought that this was fucking real. Still, even to today, when there's times where I watch this movie and I'll start doing research on it just because it's fun to think about. Like, that had an actual lore, an idea, a goal, something that was going to make people think, but also make people think something, based off of an actual, like, lore, an actual, threat, an actual creature or mythological being, something of that nature. This film is like that, except you have no real idea what is going on. Kind of like what I said about Skinamarink. It's a lot like Paranormal Activity, except you have no idea what the fuck is actually going on. Now, like I said earlier, I am very picky when it comes to experimental horror films, and I will say this. As an experimental horror film, this is probably the most I have liked out of that kind of aspect. And just honestly, like Blair Witch Project, there's things that they kind of like incorporate to the nature horror trope that really is actually genius. Like, for example, there's this one scene where they put their ear up to like a cavern, kind of like what you can do with like a seashell, when you like put it up to your ear and you can hear like the waves. Well, they put their ears like outside the wall of this cave, and they can just hear like all this shit from inside. They also do this thing, because they're musicians, where they find this like really deep fucking dank hole, and they drop like the microphone down it by like a string, and they pick up all this ambiance that's very unsettling and eerie. So they did stuff like that where I was like, okay, this actually works. I actually see that they were trying to do something specific with this kind of setting. Now, something that actually kind of grew on me with this film that I was actually like pleasantly surprised, where I was like, okay, that is one of those cases where you don't dig it at first and you think it's very basic, but it actually kind of pays off, where specifically in this movie, where I was saying like a lot of the stuff that the people are talking about in the first half of this movie where it's just random shit, there is some stuff where you feel like it is kind of leaned on a little bit too much, where you're thinking, well, maybe it's just trying to set aside these characters and trying to make them unique, and maybe it's just personal topics to them. And I know a lot of people, just by how this sounds, are going to think that this sounds very kind of expected, but a lot of this stuff ends up being incorporated into the horror eventually in this movie. Now, what I will say is that while that does sound very basic, this film, again, like I said, it has a lot to unpack, especially with the horror. It is something that I can actually say, which this is very tossed around in like horrors, and like, claustrophobia horror and like descent horrors and shit like that, that this actually is a descent into grotesque and like elevated and horror and just fucking actual madness. Now, as an actual story, I will say this, like Skinamarink, you could make a story out of this one. I think more so with Skinamarink, because it is more of a enclosed setting, where this one is really all over the place. It's off of different memory cards. There's a lot more people involved, and you actually have like a decent background of these people. But one thing that kind of rubbed me the wrong way, where I feel like it was kind of like it didn't really land right, is that this is a film where it's one of those horror films where it's like in the method of Blair Witch, you're thinking like, is this actually happening or is this all in their head? But with Blair Witch, it worked because it was actually based off of a fucking something like a witch. Where this film, it is just stuff that people found off of memory cards, and you're thinking like, this is just the desert. There's got to be more to it. I see what you're going for, and I see with everything that was incorporated in this movie, the variety of shit, yeah, stuff could have worked. And like I said earlier, this could have been they could have made a really decent horror film out of this, but like just connecting the two sides, it didn't work. It didn't land right. And just as an experimental horror film, there is a lot that they did with this film, and a lot to unpack. And I think just as an experimental horror film, this is one where you can go back and, try and dig things up and try and connect pieces more. And, there is some stuff in here that I'm sure is symbolic, but it is also just so exhausting, because not just of how the horror is, this is a very gross out, gnarly, hardcore fucking horror film. It is basically what people were saying how Savage Terrifier 2 was of 2022. This is that of 2023. It is gnarly. But also it is just exhausting just because of how much is going into it. It's honestly just kind of a headache at times. I guess what I can kind of like leave off with is that this is one of those horror films where it kind of feels like just a bunch of random, bizarre, just stuff that's trying to have an effect on you for like, in the sake of like horror stuff. But this actually does feel like it's all connected. Again, just at the end of it all, this is such a gnarly, savage film, and there's so much to unpack with it all, and especially with how hit and miss the first act is, and how it's, in the ways of how it's presented. Just, again, as a variety, this is just a film that I feel it does have a lot to give, and you can't gain respect from it. And again, they could have made a genuinely decent horror film out of this, but just maybe as an experimental horror film, maybe that wasn't the type of way to present this film. I could actually see this getting, like, if this was remade in an actual standard format, maybe it could benefit the movie a little bit better. I don't know. There's just, at the end of it all, there's some things that I really dug, things I was very surprised by, things that will definitely have an effect on any horror fan, but then there's still stuff just from a found footage horror film and an experimental horror film that are definitely going to rub people the wrong way. And overall, I'm going to give The Outwaters a mixed review. But yes, guys, that is going to do it for my review of The Outwaters. Again, this was a wild fucking zany film. There was a lot to talk about. There's really no easy way to talk about this film or to review it. But for how much buzz it's getting and how gnarly of a film this actually was, which I can, say for sure after viewing it, let me know what you guys thought about this review as well as the movie for those that did see it. But yes, guys, that is going to do it for this review. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next one. I hope you guys are having a great night. Take care.